They didn't steal money. They stole memory. The velvet box was always there, fourth drawer, right-hand case, polished mahogany with a faint lemon scent. My hand reached, expecting the familiar cool touch of brass hinges, the little resistance at the catch. Instead, I found dust, a pale outline where it had rested for decades. The drawer closed with that shallow sigh only old wood makes, as though it, too, disapproved. I stood in the back room, listening to the steady tick of the clock over the safe. The shop had its own quiet music, the hum of fluorescent tubes, faint dampness from the street outside, the perfume of polish and cloth. At my age, silence is sharper than noise. I could hear what was missing. I didn't need the camera feed. I didn't need to check the log. I knew whose hands had reached where they shouldn't. Evan's impatient shuffle, April's light-footed boldness. My brother's children, the ones I trained to polish watches without scratching the crystal, the ones who once called me Uncle Rich with admiration. They called me too old now, though never to my face. At the pawn shop on Maple, I confirmed it. Yellow slips, hot off the printer, carrying clinical descriptions written by someone with my eye but none of my care. Antique locket, 14 Kelvin, floral etch, man's signet, carnelian intaglio, pieces I could recognize by weight alone. The clerk slid the tickets forward. I signed nothing. I only held them long enough to smell the toner, then folded them into my wallet. Paper carries scent. Scent carries truth. When I stepped outside, rain slicked the pavement. In the glass door's reflection, I caught two familiar figures walking past Evan and April, laughing. They didn't see me. Betrayal has its own posture. Loose, carefree, convinced of invincibility. They thought silence meant safety. Silence, with me, is a ledger. Back in my shop, I laid the pawn slips on the felt pad where I once taught Evan to place a ring. The contrast made me smile, not warmly. A boy with trembling fingers, eager to learn. A girl proud to set a class right. Apprentices in blood, if not in discipline. Now, thieves by choice. My error wasn't teaching them, it was forgiving too easily. The phone rang. I let it. I brewed coffee instead, black and slow, the steam curling in the lamplight. My father used to say, "Don't chase a thief. Change the locks on the next door they need." He was a jeweler too. His words aged better than gold. Memory opened for me like a drawer. My father's apron, my brother's debts, Lila's smile in the doorway telling me to close early for once. And now these children, no, not children. Not anymore snickering with pockets that held my history. They thought age dulled a man. They mistook gray hair for surrender. They never learned that tempering makes metal stronger. I wrote no angry letter. I shouted no accusation. I made a list. Confirm inventory. Visit county clerk. Speak with Albright at the bank. Keep Geary's number ready, the locksmith who fixes what trust can't. Revenge for me is not fire. It is weather. Predictable, gradual, undeniable. A storm no one can stop once the air begins to shift. The following Sunday, I walked past their store. April stood at the counter laughing with customers wearing my mother's locket. Her hand rested on it as though it were hers by birthright. Evan hauled boxes in the back, pretending at labor. Their sign glowed too bright. Their shelves glittered with cheap shine. Across the street, I stood still, feeling the pawn ticket's edge against my wallet. Thin yellow maps leading me not to them, but to the ground beneath them. Paper. Always paper. I turned away, not in defeat, but toward the county building. The locks on the future had just announced themselves. The day I bought their downfall, the sky was blank, colorless. Good days for paperwork always are. Albright, my banker, shook my hand without flourish. Men like him respect routine. The folder he slid across contained the landlord's note. Small, tired debt. Owner absent, ready to be rid of it. I had the funds ready. Years of patience stored in numbers they assumed I never checked. A signature here, an assignment there, and suddenly the ground beneath Evan and April tilted. They would never hear it shift, not until the floor gave way. The lease contained the clause I hoped for. Breach by unauthorized removal or change of fixtures permits immediate recapture. Lawyers call it boilerplate. Jewelers call it inevitability. I left the office with the note tucked inside my coat. Outside, winter air cut metallic and clean. I called Geary, the locksmith. 2 days, he said. That's all I need. He didn't ask why. Men in his trade don't. They only recognize the tone of someone who has already decided. The clerk at the recorder's office stamped my file. The hollow thunk echoed like a verdict. Nearby, 2 people quarreled over a property line. I watched them wave at ink, as though ink could bend. They didn't know that paper is the sharpest blade a man can carry. 2 days later, I stood inside Evan and April's shop, clipboard in hand. April smiled too brightly, sweater soft, perfume expensive but shallow. Evan showed off displays hammered and crooked. I nodded politely. I checked boxes on the form. When I entered the back room, I saw a velvet pad, dust marking where the locket had been. Gone. I tapped my pen once, then made my mark. Breach. That evening, I wrote the letter. Notice of material breach. No fury, no embellishment. Just citations, dates, photographs, and the cure period the law required. My attorney would later call it surgical. I called it tidy. The cure period was theater. They sent apology emails, promises thick as molasses. Evan brought pastries, thought sugar could dissolve iron. April posted photos wearing the locket, captioned with heritage. Evidence, printed and stapled. They didn't know transparency is clearest when it reveals guilt. On the final day, Geary arrived at 4 sharp. His drill hummed like a quiet hymn. Outside, snow threatened but held. At 4:02, the locks turned. At 4:05, the signs went up. Closed for inventory. They arrived late from lunch, laughter dying in their throats. April's hand went to her neck instinctively. The locket wasn't there. Her fingers pressed air. Evan sputtered. I stepped forward from the doorway. Lease recapture, I said. Nothing more was needed. Their protest withered against the silence. The street didn't pause for them. No jury, no audience. Just 2 young faces discovering what inevitability feels like. The locksmith handed me the keys 3, dull silver, sharp edges. They replaced the pawn tickets in my pocket. Paper to metal, debt to closure. I did not gloat. I did not threaten. I wished them health. Then I turned my back, as one does when a chapter ends. That night, I placed the keys in my safe, not to hide them, but to honor them. Outside, snow began to fall, quieting the city. Silence is not absence, it is weight. It pressed gently against the glass, against the ground, against my chest. And in that silence, I smiled not triumph, not pride, just closure. I learned patience long before I learned price. My father ran the shop like a small church, for ordinary vows, engagements promised on layaway, watches blessed with new springs, medals polished before the parade. He kept the register neat and the counter neater. He never locked the case if a widow stood there with shaking hands. He simply rested his palm on the glass and waited until her breath found its order again. We sell time and memory, he'd say, so we owe both to the people who come in. He taught me the alphabet of metal, weight before shine, balance before brag. He could hear a loose stone by the way a ring answered the pad. When bills ran close, he skipped dinner and sold his own cufflinks. When a soldier's mother arrived with a broken chain and a face like winter, he repaired it for nothing and pushed the cash drawer shut with his knee, as if money and mercy shared a hinge. I was 12 when I realized generosity was not softness. It was a ledger you kept in your own blood. Michael, my brother, came up beside me at the bench, but never learned the music of small things. He had charm for the front room and impatience for the back. He could sell a bracelet to a woman who only came in for batteries, and then forget to order the batteries. He meant well and owed often. I got good at the back office night. Lights off, ledger lamp on, the slow arithmetic of saving a ship by moving water from one bucket to another. I met Lila on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and solvent. She leaned against the door jamb with a book and a question that turned into a decade of answers. She preferred quiet restaurants, crossword puzzles inked with certainty, and a life measured in kept promises. You're not a romantic, she once told me. You're better. You're reliable. When she died, the shop felt louder for months, as if the clock had learned to brag. Years make you into the room you stay in. I became the counter scarred but level. People trusted me with heirlooms and emergencies, with secrets only metal overhears. A groom too proud to admit he needed a payment plan. A grandmother who wanted her diamond moved to a plain band, so no one fights later. I said yes more than I should have and kept a list no one could see of what yes cost. Then came Evan and April, Michael's children, first as summer shadows in the doorway, then as hands eager to matter. I gave them the loop. I taught them the trick of listening to threads when a chain snakes through your fingers the way true links sing. April learned display fast. Color story, light angles, crowds gather. Evan learned speed. How to close a class quickly. How to talk while his hands worked. Both learned the satisfaction of the nod customers give when they feel seen. I mistook that nod for character. When Michael's heart failed, his debts did not. I covered funeral flowers and 3 months of his mortgage to keep the house from blinking past due at his children like a neon shame. I called creditors and spoke in the tone that makes men look for pens. I extended our line of credit and hid the cost from anyone who wasn't wearing my suit. The shop absorbed what it could. I absorbed the rest. The year after, I let Evan and April sell on Saturdays from a side case with their names on a card. Mallory and Company, the and Company, doing more work than either of them knew. I gave them a small cut, enough to taste obligation, not enough to choke. April found the light with velvet and mirrors. Evan found Instagram and the crank of constant praise. They brought me collabs, as if devotion could be branded. I agreed to the ones that didn't rot the air. I do not tell you this to polish my halo. I tell you this because sacrifice looks like a choice only from far away. Up close, it looks like gravity. I paid Michael's arrears because I remembered him carrying me home after I split my chin on the schoolyard rail. I gave the kids a case because I remembered his laugh. If that is a weakness, I accept the sentence. I let them use my wholesalers on a probationary list, never diamonds, only silver and modest gold, and never on memo without my countersign. I taught them how to log inventory the old way on paper before they could tap it into the cloud. I made them sign the sheet with a pencil sharp enough to remind them their names meant something. They signed with flourish. Flourish is a kind of fog. The first time April stayed late, she curated a window that drew a crowd of teenagers in hoodies who photographed themselves more than the jewelry. I stood in the dark back room and watched. Her face glowed with a satisfaction I recognized. The first time Evan stayed late, he reorganized the backstock and mislabeled half the trays because his hands outran his mind. I corrected it in silence, the way a custodian clears footprints before anyone sees the mud. I kept a book of small rescues. Mrs. Hanratty's engagement ring, resized on Christmas Eve. The church's thurible chain resoldered before midnight mass. A veteran's watch cleaned until it ticked like a second chance. I wrote each in pencil with the amount charged, often zero. And the reason, always the same, decency. When the city raised taxes on the block, I cursed once in the walk-in and then cut my own draw. I asked nothing from the kids except accuracy and respect. They gave me speed and applause. People think trust is given. I think trust is loaned at a rate you never disclose. My loan to them had simple terms. Tell the truth, count twice, and bring things back where you found them. They met the first two well enough. The third, they failed with a smile. And I, who measure stones by half points and hinges by the whisper of their clothes, missed a more important measurement: appetite. I assume gratitude holds like solder. Gratitude, it turns out, is a gas that escapes any container if the lid isn't sealed. I remember the day I handed them their first keys. April kissed my cheek and called me a saint. Evan gripped my hand too hard, the way boys do when they think strength is pressure. The keys were plain brass, edges crisp. I thought I was handing them responsibility. I was teaching their hands the map. I slept well that night anyway. You cannot predict a theft. You can only prepare the ground it will fail on. I had already begun, though I didn't know it then, to collect the paper that would matter later. When you teach someone where everything is, you also teach them how things can disappear, and what will replace them when you decide it is time. The first betrayal was not the theft. It was smaller, quieter, and easy to excuse like most betrayals are at the start. April once asked if she could borrow a strand of pearls for a photo shoot. Just for a day, she said, her voice lined with that soft charm she had perfected. I said yes, because her cheeks reminded me of her mother's when she smiled. The pearls returned 2 days later, knotted differently. A clasp tightened too quickly. I said nothing, only restrung them by lamplight. She thanked me as if I had done her a favor instead of repaired her carelessness. That night, I wrote it down in my ledger under a line no one else ever read. Returned, altered. Evan's slip was bolder. A watch, antique, meant for cleaning, left on his Instagram feed with captions about heritage design. I saw it on the screen of a customer's phone before I saw it on my bench. He laughed when I asked, called it marketing. I told him to log it properly. He waved the paper aside. I corrected the entry myself and filed the paper in the back where dust doesn't judge. That night, I wrote, public display, unlogged. A man who counts carats knows that small weights matter. A ring 1 gram lighter is no less beautiful, but no longer honest. Trust works the same. Every gram stolen stays gone. Still, I forgave. Forgiveness, to me, was not weakness, it was delay. My father had once covered for Michael when he gambled away a week's receipts, and I had watched him slide the ledger closed with no reprimand. Years later, I realized that was not mercy. It was investment. Investments either grow or they rot. Michael's rotted. I suppose I hoped his children might be different. When they asked to run the shop one weekend, I agreed. I stayed home and read the newspaper front to back, sipping coffee so slowly the pot went cold. It was the first Saturday in 40 years I didn't lift the shutters myself. My hands itched with habit. By evening, I walked by, telling myself it was only for air. Through the glass, I saw them laughing with friends. Music too loud for a place that once held silence like treasure. I smelled smoke from someone's coat. The counter shone with fingerprints. The case that had always been polished like a prayer looked smudged. I walked on without opening the door. That night, I wrote, "Keys used for noise, not trust." Lila would have scolded me, gently, for letting it go on. "You're not their shield," she'd have said, placing her hand on mine, her wedding band cool against my skin. "You're their elder. They're supposed to learn from you, not off you." She was right, but death makes memory a softener, and I gave them more chances than she would have allowed. The years pressed forward. April wore designer shoes bought with borrowed credit. Evan bought a car too bright for our street. They held themselves like inheritors, not apprentices. Customers humored them, mistaking youth for innovation. I watched and adjusted the safes, reinforced the records, updated the clauses in agreements they never read. Patience became armor. I began keeping duplicates of everything, not for safety, but for accuracy. Receipts in triplicate, inventory lists backed with photographs, copies lodged at the bank under my name only. Paper doesn't flinch when accused. Paper testifies. One winter morning, the landlord stopped by the block, a rare visit. He wore tired eyes and spoke of selling. The younger tenants begged him to stay, promised expansions and community events. Evan and April offered buzzwords and a brochure with pictures not their own. I offered him coffee, plain and hot. He drank mine. Later, when he filed intent to transfer, I knew his tired hand had already remembered my quiet kitchen. I didn't press. I waited. Waiting is what separates anger from plan. Anger burns quickly. Plans settle like sediment, patient, heavy, undeniable. The day I finally found the drawer empty velvet box gone, memory pawned, it was not shock I felt. It was recognition. They had been practicing theft for years. This was simply the first time they admitted it to themselves. To me, it was confirmation of a balance due. I walked through the rain with the pawn slips in my pocket, feeling the edges cut faint lines in the leather. I thought of my father, of Michael, of the ledgers closed too softly, of the pearls restrung, the watch flaunted, the fingerprints I wiped away myself. Each small act had been a loan of silence. This, finally, was the interest come due. That night, I sat at my desk under a single lamp and opened a fresh page. At the top, I wrote 3 words, "Begin the ledger." Below, I listed what was gone, what was owed, and what remained mine to control. The jewelry was gone. Trust was gone. The ground, however, was still in play. And ground, unlike gold, doesn't move. It waits for the one who knows how to claim it. The first time I heard them mock me, it was almost by accident. I was walking back from the bank, a brown paper cup of coffee warming my hands, when I slowed outside their store. The door was ajar, propped by that same ridiculous ceramic hand. Voices carried easily on a cold day. Evan's laugh thin, nervous, too loud struck first. Then April's words followed, sharpened by the confidence of an audience. "He still thinks he runs this block," she said. "Like anyone cares about his dusty little cases. He's too old to know what matters now." The laughter that followed didn't sting like a blade. It pressed like a thumb against an old bruise, one I had nursed quietly for years. Age to them meant irrelevance. My silence was interpreted as surrender, my patience as weakness. They had mistaken the stillness of water for the absence of current. I stood in the shadow across the street, sipping my coffee until it cooled. People passed by without notice, a boy kicking salt across the pavement, a woman tugging her dog. The city was busy being itself. My betrayal was just another conversation carried on a draft of air. When I turned away, I thought not of what they said, but of what they had forgotten. They had forgotten whose name was still written into the original lease. They had forgotten who introduced them to their first wholesaler, who vouched for their credit when they were too green to deserve it. They had forgotten that paper, unlike people, does not age. That night, I sat at my desk and drew 3 columns. Left, what they believed they owned. Middle, what the documents proved. Right, what could be turned if angled properly. The columns filled slowly, like a jeweler setting stones. By midnight, the page gleamed. The jewelry they pawned? Small matter, already accounted for. The case they call their own, still bound by the lease clause they hadn't read. The suppliers they boasted about, still answering to me, because debts carry farther than favors. Each column was a mirror they would not want to look into. I remembered when Evan was 12 and begged me to let him polish a wedding band. His hand slipped, and he left a faint scratch, nearly invisible. He cried. I told him it could be repaired, that no mistake was final, only expensive. That was the first and last time I saw him ashamed of imperfection. April, at 10, once arranged the pearls in the window so symmetrically that a crowd gathered. She thought it was genius. It was. Until she grew older and confused attention with mastery. Memory doesn't sour by itself. It sours when you see what it grew into. 2 days later, I received a postcard in my mailbox. Unsigned but obvious. A glossy photograph of their storefront with the caption scribbled on the back. The future is ours. The handwriting was Evan's, too slanted, too eager. It wasn't arrogance that struck me most. It was ignorance. He didn't understand that the future belongs only to those who own the paper it is printed on. At the bank, I met Albright again. He raised an eyebrow when I slid the postcard across the desk. Family? He asked. History, I said. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile bankers wear when they understand the mathematics of betrayal. He pushed forward a file. Inside, details of their loan applications. Numbers written in ink, bold, unflinching. Applications co-signed on confidence, not collateral. And in the margins, notes. Late, extension denied. I thanked him. Quietly, always quietly, walking home, snow crunched under my soles. The weight of the file in my coat was heavier than gold. Papers are heavier than jewelry because they don't glitter. They endure. That evening, I opened my father's old strongbox, the one with a broken clasp I never repaired. Inside, beneath faded photographs and war bonds long paid, I placed the bank file. I ran my hand across the lid before shutting it. Cold metal, colder truth. Later, at dinner alone, I set the pawn tickets beside my plate, not to gloat, not to mourn, to remind myself this began with theft, but it will end with closure. They wanted me to shout, to curse, to flail like an old man betrayed. Instead, I was building something quieter, steadier. The first column of my ledger, their arrogance, was already full. The second, the paper was growing. The third, the turn was nearly ready. And when it turned, it would not sound like thunder. It would sound like a key sliding into a new lock. The ugliest theft wasn't of metal. It was of my name. It arrived as a PDF on a Tuesday, months before the locks turned. A vendor email flagged urgent with a politeness that smelled like fear. Per your signed authorization, we released memo stones to Mallory and Company last week. Kindly confirm receipt and account terms. Attached, a one-page agreement. My name typed beneath a signature that pretended to be mine. My real signature has a practiced slant my father taught me. The R begins with a small hesitation, a notch you can feel even on slick paper, then a steady line that never wobbles. The forgery went for flourish long loop, overconfident tail, the vanity of someone who thinks drama proves truth. It looked like a carnival version of me. I printed the page and laid it on the felt. Under the loop, bad ink is louder. The strokes thickened where they should have lifted. Pressure uneven, rhythm off. Forgers forget that handwriting is breathing. You can hear anxiety wheeze in a letter if you know what breath sounds like in pen. Evan had traced the shape of my name the way boys trace engines in comic books. Convincingly wrong. I didn't call the police. I called the vendor and asked about the stones, calibrated melee, and a few larger sapphires. He said April picked them, that she loved heritage blues. He said she mentioned my oversight of their classic division. People invent departments when they need legitimacy. I thanked him for his diligence and asked him to forward the original request. He did. The email came from a free account with my name squeezed into it like a counterfeit hallmark. I printed that too and slipped both pages into a thin file marked signatures. Paper doesn't heal feelings, but it preserves fat. That night, I made tea instead of coffee. Lila used to do that when our apartment carried more sorrow than appetite. She'd put the kettle on and let the small whistle stand in for what we didn't want to say. I sat in the dark kitchen and looked at my hands. They were steady. Then I thought of my father, of the way he would lay his palm flat over a document before he signed it, as if feeling for temperature. Cold paper is honest, he'd say. Hot paper is a lie sweating through your fingers. The PDF had felt hot. I let it cool in a manila sleeve. The betrayal of signature, of voice, of provenance, hurt in a way the pawn slips hadn't. Pawn slips declare themselves. This was quieter, a whisper in my throat using my own timbre. I imagined Evan in the back room rehearsing my hand, April approving angles, both of them laughing when the bank accepted their scan. They didn't understand that every acceptance is also a receipt. Everything leaves a trail if you know which dust to look for. The wholesaler wasn't the only one. Over the next weeks, small storms crossed my desk. A courier invoice billed to me for a rush job I hadn't ordered. A collaboration announcement using my late wife's name as a founding story. A mailer with a timeline of our family brand that skipped my father entirely, but included a photo of me at 20, misdated, as if tilting history by 5 years would place them at its center. They didn't just want what I owned. They wanted what I had been. I could have written a speech. I could have slammed a fist. Instead, I made 3 phone calls and wrote 4 letters. Phone call 1, to the vendor who sent the memo stones. I told him, plain and without heat, that any future orders bearing my authorization must be confirmed by voice with a phrase we would not write down. He chose it. The watch keeps Sunday. Strange, specific, effective. Fraud hates specificity. Phone call 2, to an old friend in the trade guild. I didn't ask for sanctions. I asked for a refresher on best practices for identity misuse and for the wording of a quiet industry notice. He sent me a draft by dinner. I edited nothing. The guild published it beneath a general banner the next morning. It named no one. It told everyone. Phone call 3, to Albright. I asked him to note in whatever box bankers keep for memory that my signature would appear shortly on something else entirely. He understood without asking what. Men like us converse in the negative space. Letter 1, to the wholesaler, thanking him for his cooperation, enclosing a notarized specimen of my signature and a notice that I would not be responsible for any document that did not bear a matching seal on its page. I included a blue ink stamp, old-fashioned, embossed, he likes tools, he will use it. Letter 2, to Evan and April, lovingly formal. It described forgery as a misunderstanding I hoped they would not repeat. It did not accuse. It arranged facts like a display window that leaves no room for misreading. Letter 3, to my counsel enclosing copies and asking that he hold, not fire, the arrow. He understands the pleasure of a bow under tension. Letter 4, to myself, filed in ledger personal. It contained a single sentence. They borrowed your hand to take your voice, take their floor to give them silence. I kept working. Repairs were repaired. Birthdays appeared. Grief arrived at the counter in the shape of a man who needed a chain mended for his wife's urn, and left with thanks he couldn't say out loud. The city kept getting dark early and then brightening again. While it turned, I tied threads. You cannot weave without patience. Then came the moment I did not expect to hurt. A postcard in the window of their store, taped crooked, advertising an heirloom event learn the Mallory way. A slideshow played on a cheap tablet. There was my father's bench, photographed from a frame on my wall and color graded until it looked like an invention. There was Lila's hand turning a page, stolen from a private photo I had once given April to scan for a memorial. I felt the air leave me, not violently, like a room that has just been emptied. I stood across the street until numbness returned, the useful kind that lets a man reach into cold water without flinching. Then I went home and opened the strongbox. I placed the postcard next to the forged signature and the courier bill. I shut the lid gently, the way you close the eyes of someone who used to be kind. What broke finally was not trust. It was nostalgia. I had been holding a picture in my head of 2 children at my counter who might still be salvaged by patience. The picture had faded. Paper didn't. The next morning, I ironed a clean shirt and met Albright at 10. The file I carried was thin and decisive. When I signed the assignment that would move the ground beneath their store, the pen didn't shake. My hand made the notch on the R, paused, and carried forward. I did not take their breath away. I removed their echo. The door they had borrowed my name to open would be the door I quietly closed. The first counter move was not the lease itself. It was patience disguised as paperwork. I drafted the notice with the same care I once used to set stones, clean, precise, without excess. My counsel reviewed the language and nodded. Notice of landlord change. No drama, no insult. Just a simple statement. From this date forward, all correspondence, rents, and obligations shall be directed to Richard Mallory, assignee. It slid into the mail with the weight of inevitability. By the time Evan and April read it, it was already truth. They didn't understand what had happened. They thought it was a formality. Congrats, Uncle Rich, April wrote in her email reply with 3 exclamation points. We're so glad to have you officially on board as our partner. partner. The word clanged like tin. I answered politely, with none of the enthusiasm she expected. I thanked her for the update and requested a full insurance certificate and updated inventory within 10 business days. My father would have smiled at the phrasing. A jeweler never asks for what he does not already know is missing. That weekend, I walked the block. Their store window had changed again, more mirrors, more ribbons, louder light. The glass reflected a kind of hunger I had seen in the eyes of gamblers. Evan waved at me through the glass, beckoned me in. I lifted 2 fingers in greeting, then walked on. Silence can be read as consent, but it can also be read as distance. They didn't know which. That was the point. At home, I laid out my evidence. The pawn slips, the forged signature, the postcard, and now the lease. Each on its own sheet, each in its own file. My desk looked less like revenge and more like an archive. But archives tell stories no one can rewrite once the ink sets. Inspection day arrived crisp and bright. I wore a gray suit, tie steady, shoes shined, paperwork tucked under my arm. Inside their shop, I complimented the lighting, the energy, the crowd. I asked to see the back room. Evan laughed nervously, saying it was a mess. April tried to redirect me toward the front counter. I didn't argue. I simply walked past them. The back room smelled of polish and cheap perfume, masking something sharper. Dust where boxes should have been. A velvet pad sat bare, its oval of emptiness outlined like a scar. The locket's shadow remained, though the locket itself did not. I took photographs with the ease of a man capturing a family birthday. No rush, no secrecy, just steady records. Each click of the shutter was another hinge closing. Back at the counter, I signed their inspection sheet with a steady hand. Evan hovered, his smile faltering. April asked if everything was fine. Everything is noted, I said. The phrase carried more weight than anger. That night, I sat by the window with the city humming outside. The pawn slips rested on one side of the table, the lease notice on the other. Between them, my coffee cup steamed faintly. I thought of my father's phrase, "Don't chase thieves. Own the room they're running through." The room was almost mine, and when I closed it, the silence would not be empty. It would be final. The letter went out on a Tuesday. Not a demand, not a threat. Just a plain document headed in sober type. Notice of material breach. I cited the sections by number 9, B, 10, F, 12, 8-3, each one steady as a clock tick. Attached were photographs. The empty velvet pad, the missing stock, the unauthorized fixtures drilled into beams a century older than they were. I gave them the cure period required by law, not out of mercy, out of discipline. Paper without patience looks like anger. Paper with patience looks like destiny. Evan called first. His voice was pitched too high, as if volume could bend clauses. "It's just a misunderstanding," he said. "We'll fix it. We'll replace what's missing. You don't have to get lawyers involved." I told him calmly that lawyers were already involved. He went quiet for a beat, then tried again, softer. "Uncle, we're family. Family honors paper," I said, "or it honors nothing." Then I hung up. April came next. She visited in person, carrying a box of pastries, the same kind I used to buy her when she was a child tagging along at the shop. She set them on my counter, smiling too wide. "We just want to make things right," she said. "Don't you think this is too far?" I lifted the lid. The pastries looked soft, sugared, inviting. I closed it again without touching them. "Too far," I said evenly, "was forging my name." Her eyes flickered. She tried to laugh, to deny, but lies leave a scent, and I've been breathing truth too long. She left the box behind. I threw it out that evening, untouched. The cure period days passed like rehearsed theater. Emails with subject lines like urgent correction, deep apology, final request. Each word more desperate, each phrase more hollow. They sent updated inventory sheets that left out more than they included. They posted cheerful photographs, online April wearing the locket again, Evan gesturing over cases like a ringmaster. Every post was a confession disguised as pride. I printed each one and slid it into my file. Evidence doesn't have to shout. It just has to exist. On the final morning of the cure period, I sat in my chair by the window. Snow threatened but hadn't yet fallen. I read the lease again, slowly, the way a priest reads scripture aloud even when the congregation already knows the words. At the end of the clause, I set the paper down and folded my hands. The decision had already been made the moment they pawned memory. This was just the clock striking the hour. At 4 p.m, Geary arrived. He carried his tools in a canvas bag worn soft at the corners. He whistled as he set to work. not to mock, but to steady the rhythm. Screws turned. Cylinders clicked. A lock's death rattle is not loud. It is dignified. By the time Evan and April returned from their late lunch, the sign was already in the window. Closed for inventory. April froze. Evan sputtered, pointing, looking around for witnesses who weren't coming. I stepped out from the shadow of the doorway, coat buttoned, gloves tucked into my pocket. "Your cure period has ended," I said, soft enough for only them to hear. "The lease is mine again." "Oh, you can't," Evan started, face red, eyes darting. "I already have," I said. April's hand went instinctively to her neck. She wasn't wearing the locket this time. Perhaps she'd left it at home. Perhaps she'd sold it already. Her fingers pressed the empty space as if absence could be undone by touch. Gary tightened the last screw and handed me an envelope of fresh keys. 3, silver, sharp. I slipped them into my pocket where the pawn slips had once lived. Paper had become metal. Debts had become silence. They didn't shout. They didn't weep. They stood there on the cold sidewalk, realizing the ground had shifted while they laughed at shadows. Their store was no longer theirs. Their future was already closed. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply turned the lock once more, feeling it settle, final, and smooth. And in that soft click lived the whole story. Betrayal answered, not with noise, but with closure. Downfall rarely begins with a crash. It begins with a letter. 3 days after the locks turned, my attorney forwarded their response. Heavy with adjectives, thin on fact. They accused me of betrayal, of greed, of destroying family legacy. Words meant to sting, but words without standing. The law is not persuaded by adjectives. It listens only to clauses. I read the letter once, then folded it neatly and filed it in a drawer labeled noise. That drawer holds every complaint I've ever received that carried more emotion than evidence. It is a shallow drawer. Outside, the street carried on. Their store windows, once glowing late, now stayed dark. Customers came by, tugged at the locked door, then drifted away with the shrug people say for small disappointments. Gossip began to circulate, faint but certain, like smoke and cloth. They lost their lease. They couldn't keep up. The old man had to step in. I didn't spread the stories. I didn't need to. People invent their own explanations when a door won't open anymore. Evan tried to rally. He called suppliers, demanded extensions. One of them stopped by my shop to chuckle. "Your nephew thinks promises buy more than payment," he said. I only nodded. Silence is its own kind of confirmation. April tried charm. She emailed glossy partnership proposals to boutiques uptown. One forwarded her message to me with a single line. "Thought you should see this." Attached was April's pitch, using photographs of my shop, my cases, my late wife's handwriting copied from an old invoice. She signed it, Creative Director, Mallory Legacy. Legacy is a word that only works if the living respect the dead. I printed the email, marked it Exhibit B, and slid it behind the forged signature in my file. By the end of the month, the suppliers had closed their accounts. The guild had posted its notice, quiet, polite, without names, but understood by everyone who mattered. Vendors stopped returning calls. Their brand accounts fell silent. No new photos appeared, no bright posts of April with her hand over the locket. The silence outside their door was heavier than any padlock. I walked past one evening near closing. The sidewalk was empty, the kind of cold that keeps people indoors. In the reflection of their darkened glass, I saw Evan sitting inside on a stool, head in hands, phone glowing faint in the dark. April paced behind him, arms folded, mouth moving fast. Their words didn't carry, but I could read the rhythm. Blame, denial, desperation. They looked like actors still performing a play long after the audience had gone home. I didn't linger. I walked on. Some defeats don't need witnesses. At home, I brewed tea and sat by the window. Snow fell in slow flakes, blurring the city edges. I thought of my father again, his apron, his cigarette dangling unlit. The way he told me, patience is heavier than rage. If you wait long enough, a liar will trip over his own words. They had tripped. I had simply kept the ground level. The keys sat on my desk in their envelope. I turned them in my hand one by one, feeling the edges, sharp and true. Each key was a reminder. Paper becomes metal. Metal becomes silence. Silence becomes closure. Evan and April wanted to wound me with theft, with forgery, with laughter behind my back. Instead, they had taught me their weakness. Appetite without discipline is not strength. It is only noise. And noise eventually is swallowed by quiet. Their downfall had begun not with shouting, but with a single sound. The click of a lock they would never open again. Downfall accelerates when silence spreads faster than excuses. A week after the locks changed, Evan cornered me outside the bank. His coat was open, though the wind was sharp, his cheeks blotched with cold and frustration. "You ruined us," he hissed, voice low but trembling. "You could have just warned us. You didn't have to." I let him speak until he ran out of verbs. Then I said, calm and flat, "You ruined yourselves." I turned away before he could answer. Leaving him mid-sentence was more final than any rebuttal. By then, word had moved through the guild. Their applications for new credit met with polite rejections. No supplier wanted to extend terms to a pair with unpaid invoices and whispers of forged signatures. In our trade, reputation weighs heavier than gold. Once it cracks, no polish restores it. April tried another route. She launched a desperate sale from their personal accounts. Jewelry spread across the kitchen table, poor lighting, captions promising exclusive heritage pieces. Customers noticed immediately what was missing. No Shopee, no cases, no address. Comments piled below the posts. "Where's your store? Didn't you close? Isn't that Richard's design?" The post came down within a day, but screenshots are faster than shame. I didn't gloat. I simply clipped one of the screenshots and filed it as Exhibit C. 2 weeks later, the landlord's old manager dropped by my shop with paperwork transition details, insurance updates, small matters. He carried gossip with him like lint. "They've been trying to open elsewhere," he said. "Signed one short-term sublease, but the deposit bounced. Word is, no one wants them." He shook his head, not unkindly. "They should have stayed under your wing." I nodded, said nothing. Some truths don't require affirmation. Customers came back to me gradually, then all at once. A young couple looking for engagement rings. A retired teacher with a brooch needing repair. A man who said, "I tried them once, but it didn't feel solid." They used words like trust, steady, real. I accepted the business with quiet hands. I didn't mention Evan or April. When asked directly, I only said, "They're not operating right now. Let silence fill the rest." The last time I saw April, she crossed the street while I was locking up. She looked smaller, her coat too thin, her eyes darting. "Uncle," she said, voice cracking like cheap porcelain. "Please, we can work something out. We can come back. We'll do it right this time." I studied her face for a moment. Behind her pleading, I saw the girl arranging pearls in the window, cheeks flushed with pride. Then I saw the woman wearing my mother's locket, calling it heritage. Both lived in her, and both had chosen their path. "You had your chance," I said. No anger, just truth. I turned the key. The door clicked shut between us. She stood there, staring at the glass, until the cold wind pushed her on. At home that night, I set the day's receipts on the table. The stack was modest, not grand, but each slip was honest. Each name in the ledger carried weight. I thought of my father again, his phrase echoing, "Patience is heavier than rage." Evan and April had collapsed under the weight of their own noise. Their downfall was not my doing. I only opened the file drawer, showed the papers, and let silence do the rest. Downfall, in the end, doesn't look like flames. It looks like two figures walking down a cold street, carrying nothing but apologies no one asked to hear, and me turning off my shop lights with a steady hand, knowing the ground was mine again. Resolution doesn't come with trumpets. It comes with quiet. Weeks passed. Their names faded from invoices, from emails, from the lips of customers. The block carried on without them. New stores lit their windows. Old ones stayed steady. Life is quick to replace what collapses. Only memory lingers longer than usefulness. One morning, I walked to the corner bakery for bread. The clerk handed me the bag, warm against my palms. She nodded toward the darkened shop 2 doors down. "They moved out last night," she said. Truck came after midnight, looked rushed. She shrugged, didn't even sweep the floor. I thanked her and walked past the storefront. The glass was smudged, the awning sagged, a piece of ribbon fluttered from a nail like a remnant of a party no one enjoyed. Inside, empty shelves leaned against the wall. A faint outline marked where the display case once stood. Absence leaves its own graffiti. I paused at the door. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel pity. I felt the steady calm of completion. They were gone. The ground was mine again, not through force, not through spectacle, but through patience. That afternoon, I unlocked the door with one of the new keys Geary had cut. The lock turned smoothly, obediently. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and perfume that had lost its fight. I walked the room slowly, touching nothing, letting silence settle into the corners. The floor creaked, not unhappily. In the back room, I found a single box left behind flattened cardboard, a scrap of tissue paper. I lifted it, shook out the dust, folded it flat. Nothing of value remained. That was the point. I opened the window to let in air. The street noise drifted up: buses, footsteps, a vendor calling prices. The city was alive, indifferent. It would not remember their names. That task belonged only to me, and I chose not to carry it further. On the counter, I set down a brass key, one of the three. I traced its edge with my thumb. A key is not ownership. Ownership is the ground, the paper beneath it, the patience that holds both. Still, keys are symbols. They remind you that doors can be closed and opened and closed again. I locked up and left the shop dark. Outside, snowflakes drifted down, slow and deliberate, each flake unique, each silent, each dissolving into the same quiet street. As I walked home, I thought of Lila. She would have approved, not of the betrayal, but of the ending. She used to tell me, closure isn't loud. It's the sigh a room makes when it belongs to itself again. That sigh was in the air now. I carried the bread under my arm, warm against the cold. A simple thing, honest weight. Enough. Glozora dustes like stillness. The night after they moved out, I stayed late in my own shop. The cases were polished, the books balanced, the day's receipts counted. Nothing extraordinary, just the rhythm of a life I had chosen long ago. But the silence felt different, fuller, as though the air itself had unclenched. I sat at the counter with the 3 keys on the felt pad. Silver, sharp-edged, catching the lamplight. One by one, I turned them in my palm. They were heavier than their size allowed, not because of metal, but because of meaning. They were the conclusion of a ledger written in patience. I remembered the pawn slips, yellow and thin, the first insult. I remembered the forged signature, too confident and too careless. I remembered the laughter I overheard through an open door, my name bent into mockery. Each of those memories could have been a wound. Instead, they became evidence. And evidence properly handled becomes closure. I walked to the door, turned the key, and stepped into the cold street. Snow had stopped falling. The air was crisp, the night unusually clear. Across the block, their old storefront stood empty. Dark windows, crooked awning, silence behind glass. It looked less like a place of business and more like a memory already fading. I didn't cross the street. I didn't need to. My victory wasn't inside those walls. It was in the fact that I could look at them and feel nothing. No hunger, no anger, no need to speak. Just the calm weight of having finished something properly. A couple walked past, glancing at my lit window. The woman said, "That place has been here forever." She didn't know I heard. She didn't need to. Legacy isn't the sign above a door. It's the trust in strangers' voices when they speak without prompting. At home, I placed the keys in my safe beside Lila's letter, the one I never read because I don't need to. I know her words already. Patience, Richard. Always patience. I poured myself a small glass of whiskey, amber and steady in the lamplight. I raised it not to revenge, not to triumph, but to silence. To the kind of silence that doesn't feel like absence, but like balance restored. I closed my eyes and smiled. Not wide, not sharp, just quiet. And in that quiet smile lived the end of their noise, and the return of my peace.